What if I told you that in 1855, a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia committed what historians call one of the most significant acts of resistance in American history? On a summer night in Missouri, she made a choice that would challenge the very foundations of slavery itself. This is the story of a woman who refused to be broken, even when it meant facing the ultimate price. Meet Celia, the enslaved woman who killed her master and changed history forever. In the suffocating heat of summer 1850, a 14-year-old girl named Celia arrived at Robert Newsom's prosperous farm in Callaway County, Missouri. Her childhood abruptly ended by a financial transaction that reduced her humanity to mere dollars and cents. Newsom, a widowed farmer in his late 50s, had not purchased Celia to tend his crops or livestock like his other enslaved workers. Instead, she was acquired to fulfill a far more sinister and personal purpose: to replace his deceased wife in the most intimate and degrading way imaginable. The horror began immediately during the journey from the slave market to Newsom's property, as he violated her repeatedly in the back of his wagon, establishing a brutal pattern that would define the next 5 torturous years of her existence. Upon reaching the farm, Celia was housed in a small, isolated cabin positioned deliberately far from the main house and the quarters where other enslaved people lived. This strategic placement served Newsom's twisted purposes perfectly. It ensured his crimes would remain hidden from witnesses, prevented Celia from finding comfort or solidarity among other enslaved people, and guaranteed that her cries for help would echo unheard across the empty Missouri countryside. The cabin, which should have been a sanctuary of rest after long days of labor, instead became a chamber of systematic torture where Newsom visited regularly, treating Celia not as a human being with feelings, fears, and dreams, but as his personal property to be used whenever and however his desires dictated. Over the course of 5 brutal years, this pattern of abuse resulted in the birth of 2 children, innocent souls brought into the world through violence and violation. These children served as constant, living reminders of Celia's powerlessness and the systematic dehumanization that defined every aspect of her existence. The psychological toll was immense. She lived in perpetual fear and anxiety, never knowing when Newsom's heavy footsteps would approach her door, never able to find peace even in sleep. The broader community, while perhaps suspecting the true nature of her relationship with their respected neighbor, remained complicit through their silence, as was tragically common in a society that viewed enslaved people as property rather than human beings deserving of protection, dignity, and basic rights. Celia's youth made her suffering even more heartbreaking. She had been robbed not only of her freedom but of her childhood, her innocence, and her fundamental right to grow into womanhood on her own terms. As Celia matured from a traumatized child into a young woman bearing the invisible scars of years of systematic abuse, an unexpected ray of hope entered her dark world through her relationship with George, another enslaved person working on Newsom's farm. George represented everything that had been cruelly denied to Celia: genuine affection offered freely rather than demanded through violence, respect for her as a complete human being rather than an object for gratification, and the revolutionary possibility of a relationship built on mutual care and understanding rather than domination and terror. Their connection developed slowly and secretly, hidden from Newsom's watchful and possessive eye, providing Celia with her first precious taste of what love could be when freely given and received between equals. In George's presence, Celia could momentarily transcend her legal status as property and reconnect with her essential humanity. She could laugh without fear, share her thoughts without being dismissed, and experience physical intimacy as an expression of love rather than an act of violence and control. These stolen moments of tenderness and normalcy became beacons of light in the darkness of her daily existence, reminding her that somewhere beneath the layers of trauma and dehumanization, the girl she might have been in different circumstances still existed. George's love awakened in her a fierce desire for dignity and autonomy that had been systematically suppressed through years of brutalization. However, this relationship also introduced new layers of complexity and pain into Celia's already unbearable situation. George, while intimately familiar with the general cruelties of slavery, could not fully comprehend the specific horror of sexual bondage that defined Celia's existence. As their relationship deepened, he began to pressure her to resist Newsom's advances, to assert her right to refuse his demands, not understanding that such resistance could mean death not just for her, but potentially for him and others on the farm who might be suspected of influencing her rebellion. His suggestions that she could simply say no to her master revealed the tragic gap between male and female experiences of enslavement, where women faced additional layers of vulnerability and exploitation that even other enslaved people sometimes failed to fully grasp. The emotional whiplash of moving between these two vastly different relationships, tender love with George and violent abuse with Newsom, created a psychological strain that manifested in physical symptoms and emotional turmoil. Celia was forced to compartmentalize her existence in ways that challenged the very foundations of her sanity, presenting one version of herself to the man who cherished her while enduring an entirely different reality with the man who brutalized her. The contrast between George's gentle touch and Newsom's violent hands, between moments of genuine human connection and periods of complete objectification, became increasingly unbearable as her sense of self-worth, nurtured by George's love, made Newsom's violations feel even more intolerable than before. By the spring of 1855, Celia found herself pregnant for the third time, carrying another child conceived through rape. This pregnancy differed dramatically from her previous ones. Her body, weakened by years of systematic abuse, chronic stress, and the psychological trauma of her impossible situation, struggled to carry the developing child. The physical discomfort was severe and constant, yet Newsom showed absolutely no intention of respecting her condition or providing even the most basic consideration for her health and well-being. His visits to her cabin continued with the same regularity and violence as before, treating her pregnant body with the same callous disregard he had always shown for her humanity. The pressure from George to resist Newsom's advances intensified during this vulnerable period, creating an impossible dilemma that threatened to tear Celia apart emotionally and psychologically. On one side stood the man who loved her, demanding that she assert her fundamental right to bodily autonomy and human dignity, while on the other side loomed the harsh reality of a legal and social system that granted her no such rights and punished any hint of defiance with swift and brutal retribution. Missouri's slave laws were crystal clear in their dehumanization. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. They possessed no legal right to refuse their masters' demands regardless of how degrading or harmful, and any act of resistance could be punished by torture, sail away from family, or death. In a moment of extraordinary courage born from utter desperation, Celia made what would prove to be her final attempt at negotiation with her abuser. Approaching Newsom directly, an act that required tremendous bravery given the power dynamics of their relationship, she begged him to leave her alone, at least until after the birth of her child. With tears streaming down her face, she explained that the pregnancy was particularly difficult, that her body desperately needed rest and recovery time, and that his continued sexual assaults were endangering both her life and the life of the unborn child. This plea represented perhaps the first time in 5 long years that Celia had attempted to assert any agency whatsoever over her own body, to claim even the most minimal right to physical safety and basic human consideration. Newsom's response was swift, cruel, and utterly predictable. He not only refused her desperate request but seemed genuinely angered by her audacity in making it. In the harshest terms possible, he reminded her that she was his property, not his employee, not his tenant, not even his servant, but his property, and that her body belonged to him to use exactly as he saw fit, whenever he chose, regardless of her comfort, health, or survival. Her feelings, her pain, her very life were completely irrelevant to his desires and plans. This brutal rejection of her plea for the most basic human decency shattered something fundamental and irreparable within Celia's spirit. The last vestiges of hope that some minimal consideration might someday be shown for her humanity died in that moment, replaced by a cold, crystalline determination that would soon change both their fates forever. On the evening of June 23, 1855, as shadows lengthened across the humid Missouri countryside and cicadas began their evening chorus, Robert Newsom made his way along the familiar path to Celia's cabin for what would prove to be the final time. The air was thick with summer heat and oppressive humidity, and Celia, heavy with her third unwanted pregnancy and exhausted from another day of labor and anxiety, sat in her small cabin desperately trying to find some measure of physical comfort and emotional peace. When she heard Newsom's unmistakable footsteps approaching through the darkness, the same sound that had haunted her dreams and waking hours for 5 interminable years, her heart began to race with the automatic dread that had become as involuntary as breathing. As Newsom entered her cabin with the entitled swagger and predatory confidence of a man who had never once been denied anything he desired, Celia summoned every ounce of courage remaining in her battered spirit to make one final, desperate appeal to whatever trace of humanity might still exist within him. She pleaded with him to leave her alone, her voice breaking as she reminded him of her advanced pregnancy, of her physical weakness and deteriorating health, of the very real danger that continued sexual assault posed to both her survival and that of the unborn child. Her words, spoken through tears of desperation and terror, fell on ears that had been deaf to her suffering for half a decade. It was in that pivotal moment, as Newsom moved toward her with clear and familiar intent, completely dismissing her pleas as he had countless times before, that something fundamental and irreversible shifted within Celia's consciousness. The accumulated weight of 5 years of systematic abuse, the cruel rejection of her recent desperate appeals for mercy, the stark realization that no amount of submission, compliance, or begging would ever earn her even the most basic respect due to a human being. All of these factors converged into a single brilliant moment of absolute clarity. She would not submit again. Whatever the consequences might be, whatever the ultimate cost to herself and others, she would not allow this man to violate her body and soul one more time. As Newsom reached for her with hands that had caused her so much pain and trauma, Celia's fingers closed around a large stick she had been using to tend the fire in her modest hearth. The improvised weapon felt solid and real in her grasp, perhaps the first object in years that had felt truly under her control. When Newsom grabbed her, completely ignoring her tears and desperate protests as he had always done, she raised the stick and brought it down upon his head with all the strength that 5 years of suppressed rage, desperation, and newfound determination could provide. The first blow stunned him, causing him to stagger backward with surprise and confusion, but his years of absolute power over her made it impossible for him to believe that his property would dare to resist him. As he moved toward her again, his face now contorted with fury at her unprecedented defiance, Celia struck a second time with deadly precision. Robert Newsom, the man who had stolen her childhood, her innocence, her autonomy, and 5 irreplaceable years of her life, collapsed to the floor of her cabin and never rose again. Standing over Newsom's lifeless body in the flickering firelight, Celia experienced a complex torrent of emotions that would be impossible for anyone who had not endured her specific suffering to fully comprehend. There was overwhelming relief, the blessed, almost euphoric realization that her tormentor could never hurt her again, that the footsteps she had dreaded for so long would never again approach her door. There was stark terror at the magnitude of what she had done and the inevitable consequences that would follow once the body was discovered. And beneath it all, there was a strange, fierce pride in finally having asserted her fundamental humanity in the most definitive way possible, in proving to herself that she was more than the piece of property Newsom had tried to reduce her to. But these powerful emotions had to be quickly suppressed and channeled into practical action, for Celia understood with crystal clarity that discovery meant certain death, not just for herself, but potentially for George and others who might be suspected of encouraging or assisting her rebellion. With the methodical thinking of someone whose survival had always depended on quick wit, careful planning, and the ability to think several steps ahead of those who held power over her life, Celia began the gruesome but necessary task of completely disposing of Newsom's remains. Simply hiding the body would be useless. Newsom's absence would be noticed within hours, and any physical evidence would immediately seal her fate and potentially implicate others in her desperate act of self-defense. When Robert Newsom failed to appear for his predictable morning routine, alarm spread quickly throughout the farm and surrounding community. Newsom was renowned for his rigid habits and reliable schedule, making his unexplained absence immediately suspicious to family members, neighbors, and the enslaved people who depended on his routines for the rhythm of their own daily lives. An intensive search began within hours, with dozens of people combing every inch of the property for signs of the missing farmer. Initial theories centered on possible accidents. Perhaps he had fallen into a well, been injured by livestock, or suffered some medical emergency while alone. But as the search continued without success and investigators began to piece together the timeline of his disappearance, suspicions inevitably turned toward more sinister possibilities. The investigation focused immediately on the farm's enslaved population, as the racist logic of the time dictated that they would be the most likely suspects in any crime against their master. Enslaved people were presumed to harbor natural resentments against their owners and to be inherently prone to violence and rebellion, making them automatic suspects whenever white authority figures came to harm. Celia, despite her desperate attempts to appear normal and appropriately concerned about Newsom's disappearance, quickly became a primary person of interest. Her nervous behavior, combined with the investigators' knowledge of her special relationship with Newsom, made her the focus of increasingly intense scrutiny and interrogation. Under relentless questioning that likely included threats of torture commonly used to extract confessions from enslaved people, Celia eventually broke down and admitted to killing Newsom. However, her confession was not the simple admission of guilt that her interrogators expected to hear. Instead, it became a powerful declaration of her right to defend herself against sexual assault, a concept that was not merely legally questionable under Missouri's slave laws, but completely impossible and incomprehensible within the existing legal framework. Her detailed confession revealed not just the mechanics of Newsom's death and her methodical disposal of his remains, but the full scope of the systematic sexual abuse she had endured for 5 years, painting a picture of sustained trauma that shocked even some of her interrogators. Celia's trial, which began in October 1855, became one of the most legally and morally significant cases in Missouri's antebellum history, raising fundamental questions about the nature of human rights, the limits of property ownership, and the intersection of gender, race, and power in American society. Judge William Hall made the surprising decision to appoint competent legal counsel to defend Celia, reflecting both the complexity of the legal issues at stake and perhaps some recognition that the case transcended simple questions of property destruction. Her defense attorneys, led by John Jameson, crafted a revolutionary argument that challenged the very foundations of slave law. They contended that Missouri statutes granting women the right to defend themselves against sexual assault applied to all women, regardless of race or legal status, and that Celia had acted within her legal rights when she killed Newsom to prevent her own rape. The prosecution, representing the established order and the economic interests built on enslaved labor, countered with the harsh reality of existing law. Enslaved people were legal property, and property could not possess rights against its owner. They argued that Celia's killing of Newsom represented the destruction of valuable property by property itself, a legal impossibility that could only be addressed through the harshest punishment available under Missouri law. Throughout the trial, prosecutors painted Celia as a dangerous example of what happened when enslaved people were allowed to believe they possessed rights equal to those of white people, arguing that her acquittal would encourage widespread rebellion and the collapse of the social order upon which Missouri's economy depended. Despite the eloquent arguments of her defense team and the horrific details of abuse that emerged during testimony, the outcome was never truly in doubt. On October 9, 1855, an all-white, all-male jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Hall sentenced Celia to death by hanging, scheduled for November 16. Although her attorneys filed appeals that delayed the execution until December 21, 1855, there was no realistic hope that Missouri's legal system would acknowledge the humanity and rights of an enslaved woman who had killed her white master, regardless of the circumstances that drove her to that desperate act. On a cold December morning, as snow began to fall across the Missouri countryside, Celia was led to the gallows that had been erected specifically for her execution. Even in her final moments, she maintained the dignity and strength that had carried her through 5 years of unimaginable abuse and the ordeal of her trial. Her death was intended as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of resistance, but instead became a powerful symbol of the indomitable human spirit's refusal to accept dehumanization. Celia had proven that even under the most desperate circumstances, even facing certain death, the fundamental human desire for dignity and autonomy could not be completely crushed. Her story, though largely forgotten for many years, would eventually be recognized as a crucial chapter in the long struggle for human rights and gender equality, a testament to one woman's courage in asserting her humanity against a system designed to deny it completely.